Alright, what's going on, guys? Trev back again, here to bring you another video. This one's going to be doing another versus matchup type of video, but this time we're going to be doing a versus between a couple television series. Two of the biggest television series on currently, 2014, and that is with 4 seasons, AMC's The Walking Dead, and currently airing in its 4th season, HBO's Game of Thrones. Let's do it. Alright, good stuff. So this one for me is a fun one to make because I always see people arguing in comments when I do reviews for Game of Thrones, and I do recognize that most of my subscriber base is for The Walking Dead. So any Game of Thrones fans, try not to flame The Walking Dead in the comments, or I can pretty much promise you're going to get spammed like crazy. Vice versa is sort of true. Try not to flame Game of Thrones too bad, or at least for no reason, because you'll probably get spammed too. This is one that becomes pretty heated sometimes in comments. So all I would ask is try to be respectful of each other and try to appreciate each show for the qualities that it has. They're both huge shows. They're both widely successful, extremely successful for a reason. And we're comparing here to kind of... well, I am to give my thoughts on which one I enjoy more, but definitely there's people that are gonna like Game of Thrones more, and there's people that are gonna like The Walking Dead more, based on some factors that I'm gonna cover in this video. So just please try not to get too personal or anything like that. Feel free to kind of discuss like in a polite manner, which show you like better and why, what the reasons are or the reasons for it are. That said, with this comparison, this versus type matchup, I'm basically going to go over what makes each show special, and then I'm going to compare them both for the general story. Obviously, the comic books from Robert Kirkman for The Walking Dead are extremely successful, very, very successful books, considering they were published by Image, which isn't like one of the big two, Marvel or DC. It's incredible how successful it's become, and it's because of the initial story, and, well, Frank Darabont helped out with the idea to start the television series. On the other hand, Martin's books were extremely successful before HBO took the show on anyway for Game of Thrones. So both have incredible stories, and one of them may cater to some people more than the other. Some people may like one direction more than the other. Now, the big difference for me, okay, well, first off, they're in completely different worlds, okay? The Walking Dead, of course, you have your zombie apocalypse, and what makes it special compared to most zombie movies is we get to see characters survive in a zombie apocalypse world over the long term. So we get to see a survivor group over years rather than just a couple days or a month or something in a movie, and we can see them struggle with all kinds of different concepts and different things that don't occur in a small time interval during a zombie apocalypse type movie. And I think what makes it so special is getting to see the characters change, survivors die, and how over the long term characters form groups, relationships, and develop into something entirely different for that world. That, for me, is what makes The Walking Dead so special, is the character concentration in a zombie apocalypse with relative uncertainty of who's going to survive, who's going to die. That's basically The Walking Dead. Plus, it's got some really likable characters. I think Rick Grimes is one of the most likable characters, probably the most likable in any zombie apocalypse story ever written. I would go that far as to say that. The others as well, too. There's some really excellent characters in the story. It's very exciting. There's some good bad guys, some great groups, and different things that occur between them in great environments. So that's The Walking Dead in a nutshell for the first 4 seasons. Game of Thrones in a nutshell for its first 4 seasons, or we're not even halfway through season 4, but where we're at right now for season 4. I would say, if I had to kind of sum up Game of Thrones, of course you have a medieval fantasy type series So you have your dragons, you have your, but they don't start off with too much of it. First, it's more like a medieval type tale. Then they get into the supernatural elements a little bit more as it goes, and bring them in more and more and more. You have some complex storytelling between the politics of, I want to say, the throne and territory and power. Okay. You also have some interesting ethical considerations over. Ethics is a big influence in the show, is a big theme of it. It seems like Martin it really tries to send home that in this kind of world, being a good person, being ethical, really doesn't pay. For the most part, it really doesn't. By the way, this will contain spoilers for both shows. If you guys haven't seen most of them, I may ruin some things for you, so heads up on that if you watch one and not the other. If you intend to watch the other, you may not want to watch this video because I may ruin some things here and there. So with Game of Thrones, you have that fantastical medieval environment. You have this sort of survival aspect similar to The Walking Dead, where like one of the themes is all men must die. You have characters dying off consistently. Every season, every few episodes, some characters will die here and there. It also has, I would say, pretty much 100% uncertainty over who's going to live and who's going to die. The Walking Dead has got relative uncertainty, but I feel like for the most part, there are some deaths that The Walking Dead won't go as far to do. Example of that would be Rick Grimes at this point. I would say Rick is a character that will not be killed off anytime soon. I'd say Carl also has that sort of relative certainty, and maybe at this point Daryl in the TV series does as well too. Game of Thrones, on the other hand, has complete uncertainty. There's not one character in that show that you can be sure, if you haven't read the books or you have no idea, when you're reading it through or when you're watching it through, there's not a single character in that show that you can be sure is going to make it. Not one, not a single one. And that is completely different from almost any series, any comic book or TV series, novel I've ever read, where you're reading through it and you think it's going to go this way and it goes the other way. And then you think, okay, well, it went this way, now it's got to go this way, and it goes the other way again. And that's what happens with Martin's Song of Ice and Fire with Game of Thrones. So here's the spoiler part now. We'll just get into the nitty-gritty. It's kind of the equivalent as this. Now, people will say with Game of Thrones, there's no main protagonist. Like in The Walking Dead, you have Rick Grimes. In Game of Thrones, you don't really have a Rick Grimes. And I will agree with that to a degree. The first season, Eddard Stark, Ned, is basically our Rick Grimes. But only for the first season, I would say. Now, that said, the show's not 100% concentrated on his group, but in The Walking Dead, they're not always just concentrating on Rick either. Season 4, the second half, is a good example where, there was lots of episodes that Rick wasn't even in, right? So when you compare it like that, when you think about it like that, Game of Thrones is kind of like that. They do have a Rick Grimes who would be Ned, in my opinion, Eddard, with his family, House Stark. But you have more concentration on other characters too, similar to the second half of The Walking Dead season 4 versus the earlier parts of the earlier seasons. So with Game of Thrones, your Rick Grimes, so to speak, as you go through the first season, is killed by, I would say, the bad guy. Yeah, that makes sense. The bad guy. Now again, Game of Thrones people like to correct and they like to argue. So if you want to argue that no one's bad in Game of Thrones, you go right ahead, you do that, but I'm not going to pay attention to you. I'm just letting you know ahead of time. Joffrey is bad. That's all there is to it. He's a bad guy. Cersei is a bad guy. That's all there is to it. Now you can say, oh, people are layered in Game of Thrones. There's areas of gray, blah, blah. Like I said, I'm not going to address you if you do that. I look at it very binary. If you benefit the world, if you benefit the people of the world, you're a good person. If you don't, you're a bad person. Yes, everyone kind of, teeters. Sometimes they might not be that good if they do something that's wrong. Other times they will. But overall, are they good or bad? In Game of Thrones, there's lots of characters that are bad. And Lannisters, except for Tyrion for the most part, are bad. Basically, for the most part. Now, they protect their own selfish interests, so that makes sense. But they're basically our bad family, our bad house, our bad guys compared to the Starks, who are your good ones that follow strong morals, follow strong ethics that Eddard instills in them, and try to always do the right thing, try to always do what's right. There are certain occasions where they may bend a little bit because of the world. Rob doesn't keep his vow to marry Walder Frey's daughter, so that's something that's a little bit off, right? Eddard's, some of the things he does right up near the end, he kind of strays a little bit off that path. But for the most part, these are ethical people, and that's sent home. So, the equivalency and the differences between these stories, aside from the fact that the worlds are entirely different, and you have more of a disbursement of focus on different characters in Game of Thrones, whereas in The Walking Dead you have more concentration on a smaller group, okay, with most of the concentration on Rick. Your Rick Grimes, so to speak, or I want to say half because it's kind of dispersed, like I said, because you have Dany and you have Tyrion, you have the others, right, as well too in Game of Thrones, Jon Snow and everybody. Lots of characters, very very deep world that it doesn't just focus on one. But House Stark, for example, they basically lose. Let's just put it that way. They lose, okay? They die, pretty much. Now, people are, they're not all dead. Yeah, I know they're not all dead. I know that. But what I'm saying is your main leads, your Rick Grimes, your Ned is dead. Your Carl, the equivalent is, let's say, Robb Stark in Game of Thrones, dies when you don't expect him to. And yes, there's Arya, Sansa, and the others. But for the time being right now, they have essentially lost to the bad guy. It's the equivalent as if, let's say the governor was Tyrion or Tywin, and he killed Rick and took his gun and then gave his gun to his another character to help him out. I don't know. So Martinez, maybe, let's say. So that's kind of the equivalency of the differences between the stories of how they stray with regards to House Stark. You have all the other houses too, and different things happening and characters in Game of Thrones, and it's a pretty diverse world. But the heavy concentration on the series so far has been, I would say, vengeance from characters dying at certain times, and the throne, of course, who's in fighting for the throne, as well as some of the other fantastical elements as well. You got the dragons, you got the White Walkers, you got the Wall, you got other things thrown in there as well too. It's very diverse. I don't want to just try to simplify it to say it's only about one thing. It's not. Game of Thrones is very diverse. The Walking Dead also is too. But basically, the differences between the stories and who's going to like which better. I think Game of Thrones, people will like it because it's so different, where the lead, your main good guy, dies, right? Terribly to the bad guy. Just straight up, like Joker shoots Batman in the face. That's it. Batman just dies. And then Robin just dies. And then afterwards we take it from there, and the Joker's still running crazy for a while until eventually somebody else out there kills him. Let's say Harley kills him or something. That's the kind of story that Game of Thrones is, where the bad guy just straight up wins, and we kind of refocus afterwards to all these other characters out there and to see what's going to happen next, and just follow the bad guy for a little while, and follow, maybe you've got Tyrion in there who's like a good guy as a part of a bad group, and what's going to happen with him. And basically, with that, you have total uncertainty of whether or not the protagonist is going to win or lose. And as you're reading it through, they basically lose. So you have no certainty at all of who's going to win, who's going to lose in that story. Totally open for anybody to win or lose based on if it's realistic for that world, if it makes sense for that universe. Does it make sense that the good guy would beat the bad guy if the bad guy has a lot more money, more men, more power, more conniving, and all these things? No. So in Game of Thrones, the good guy loses. In The Walking Dead, even if the governor has a tank and has a lot of people and has kind of gets the jump on Rick's group still wins. Right, because kind of that's the general direction the story goes in. Game of Thrones is the opposite, right? So I think that's the main key right there. People will like which will people like better? Do people like to see a story that's completely organically natural to the characters and the situation they're in, with total honesty to how things would really play out? Okay, and that the good guy could lose if he doesn't have enough power to beat the bad guy, because whether or not you're good or bad is really irrelevant to who's going to win. And in fact, the bad guy may have an advantage because he's willing to do what the good guy's not. That's Game of Thrones. The Walking Dead, you kind of feel like at the end of the day, yeah, they could kill Rick and Carl. I doubt it, though. It's kind of one of those things. You're not absolutely certain they're going to make it, but you probably don't think they're going to do it either. Whereas in Game of Thrones, they just go for it. So, aside from the fact that the worlds themselves are different, fantastical medieval world, zombie apocalypse, I think that's a heavy part in, that's probably the main factor right there in which one people are going to like better. Me, myself, personally, I do like to see the good guy win for the most part. I like to see the guy that, that does the right thing for the most part succeed. Is it 100% realistic that that's how it would go? No, it's not. I would say no, it's not 100%. But I think The Walking Dead does a pretty good job of making it mostly realistic for the most part, because you do have Rick. He'll lose important characters to him, family, close friends. People like this will die off. But at the end of the day, I still feel like over the long term, we're following Rick for a reason. We're following his story because over the long term, he's going to do some amazing things and either restart society or create a big, form together a huge group that has a great chance of surviving in a zombie apocalypse for a really, really long time and help people. He's going to do something great. And that's why we put our time into following him and hearing his story and the people around him's story. Game of Thrones, on the other hand, we follow people, but because it's 100% realistic, they don't win, right? Because that's the way it would really play out with those characters if this was real, if this was reality. So they don't, but we end up following characters that it honestly kind of feels like there's almost no point because they end up just losing anyway. We do get to meet the characters around them, their family members, other people involved, the bad guys as a part of it, and the story organically kind of continues on from there, sometimes focusing on the winner or the bad guys, right? And that's that story. So it kind of depends what people, I think that's the biggest thing of what people would, consider when they're making this comparison. What kind of story do they like better? Totally complete uncertainty over who's going to win and who's going to survive, or relative uncertainty but still low probability, I'd say, that you're going to see Carl and Rick be killed and then the story continue around other characters, right? I would think. So personally, I go to that one. Also, I like to see the characters change over time and evolve and develop. In Game of Thrones, in a zombie apocalypse, in Game of Thrones, you do see that with some characters, but others you don't because they're killed off so quickly. And there could be characters that their evolution could be very interesting, but we don't really get there with a lot of them because they just get killed off more quickly than you really have time. I'm talking about like your equivalent of Rick being killed the first season, your equivalent of Carl being killed at the end of the third season. This is a really It's a really different type of story. Some people may just think that that's the greatest thing since sliced bread. It's like the best thing ever because you really have no idea what's going to happen in that type of story, in that type of world. You really don't. And I got to admit, that's really attractive because it's so different from anything you're used to. Whereas with the other, you still feel like you're following them for a reason, and over time, things are going to, for the most part, probably work out. Even if a lot of characters are killed, you'll see Rick do something great before eventually he's killed in the story, which he probably will be eventually, but it probably won't be anytime soon, I would imagine. So let me know what you guys think. Let me hear you weigh in on this one. The Walking Dead versus Game of Thrones. Me, my favorite, I got to go with The Walking Dead for the character development, the world, and to sort of see that long-term story where I feel like the characters that I like and I care about and I enjoy watching and following, those characters, for the most part, are going to win. For the most part. Or at least survive. Or the opposite, where you see those types of characters lose with complete uncertainty of what's going to happen next. Well, you may like some other characters, too, that don't lose. They don't all. But you guys, I think you guys get where I'm coming from with this one. So I think that's the main difference between the two. So let me know what you guys think. Who wins this one for you? Is The Walking Dead better than Game of Thrones? Or is Game of Thrones just got that something different that really you haven't seen anything like before, and is that where it's at for you? Let me know what you guys think. I'll call it here. That's it for this video, guys. I'll see you for the next one. This is Trev. As always, stay in peace.